This group of German students was extremely excited because the war had broken out and they had been selected to join the army. The old professor's impassioned speech made everyone's blood boil, as if they could become honorable warriors on the battlefield. Paul received his military uniform, and what surprised him was that it had someone else's name on it. The officer ripped it off and threw the tag to the ground. Little did Paul know that this new uniform was stained with the blood of fallen soldiers. After a battle, soldiers would take off the clothes of the dead, collect them together, clean the blood stains, and then workers would sew them up, and finally hand them over to this group of ignorant recruits. They marched towards the battlefield with confident steps, singing songs, as if everyone could see the light, but little did they know that they were heading towards hell bit by bit. When they arrived at the battlefield on the Western Front, no one could laugh when they looked at the rocks and ruins everywhere. A few artillery shells fell, shattering all the illusions of this group of young people. Finally arriving at the front line, the first task was not to kill the enemy, but to clear the water in the trenches. This group of recruits finally woke up. As night falls, flares continue to rise into the sky. Paul found a dying Frenchman and took aim with his gun.
举枪瞄准.
Then, a bullet grazed Paul's helmet. A veteran came over, his name was Kate, and warned Paul that it was very dangerous to shoot at night and that he should change his shooting location. After the next flare was fired, artillery fire followed and everyone hurriedly fled towards the fort. The new recruits covered their ears and shivered, while the veterans were not surprised. In despair and fear, some recruits went crazy. He tried to run out of the fortress and was blown to pieces. Then the fortress collapsed, everyone was buried, and his comrades were dug out by Paul. A night of artillery fire left the battlefield littered with corpses. Kate handed him a piece of dry food and after a few simple bites, Paul was assigned the task of collecting the name tags of dead soldiers. These classmates who once sat with him in the classroom have now turned into corpses. Paul moved forward to search, but stepped on a pair of glasses. He recognized them as belonging to his friend. When he opened the body in front of him, a familiar face appeared in front of him. Paul cried loudly for the first time. 2 years later, the war became more and more cruel, with 40,000 casualties every month, but Germany did not take any advantage. Even so, a steady stream of new soldiers were sent to the front. Paul's team received the mission and went to pick up the new recruits. When he pushed open the door of the warehouse, Paul was dumbfounded. There were all densely packed corpses.
Haben die Masken zu früh abgenommen. Bald ist Deutschland leer.
Paul and others rushed to the front line again. They looked at the opponent's position from a distance. The commander gave the order to charge. No one hesitated. They rushed out of the trench and turned on the machine guns. Paul didn't dare to look, let alone stop. Paul reached the enemy trench, threw a grenade, and continued his charge. Skilled in stabbing enemy soldiers to death and shooting wounded enemies, 2 years of war had turned this young man into a ruthless machine. A Frenchman struggled with Paul, and the engineer's shovel was swung fiercely, knocking the man to the ground. Just when he was about to kill him, he saw the man's face clearly. He was as young and as helpless as him. 2 veterans occupied the kitchen and looked at the delicious food. They immediately started to devour the delicious food. Paul also started to eat delicious food. However, the ground suddenly shook and the 3 of them felt bad. When they went out to take a look, several huge steel machines appeared in the fog, and bullets were fired at them. He leaned out, but the tank was unscathed. Several shells came down. The German soldiers no longer had the courage to face him, and they could only flee from the trenches they had just captured. Paul watched his comrades being crushed by tanks. What was supposed to be a confrontation between people has now turned into a massacre by machines. Kate pulled out a grenade, inserted it into the track of the tank, and inserted another into the machine gun window. The French soldiers who escaped were eliminated, but the screams from the rear were even more tragic, and the artillery mercilessly devoured the lives of the soldiers. Seeing the enemy approaching, Paul fled in panic as the shell blew him away. Amid the roar, he saw someone trying to surrender, only to be swallowed up by the fire. Is this the war you longed for? While retreating with the large army, Paul was approached by a fighter plane and approached a puddle. His comrades ran away one by one. He did not dare to move anymore, so he picked up a dagger and pretended to be dead. A French soldier also fell into the puddle. Paul seized the opportunity and rushed forward with a dagger. He stabbed him several times. He could no longer make any sound and kept swallowing blood. The man turned his head to Paul, as if asking for help. At this moment, Paul began to doubt the hatred that the country had instilled in him. He had never seen this Frenchman, so where did the life and death hatred between Paul and him begin? Paul fed him some water, took off his clothes, and tried to bandage him, but the soldier quickly died. Paul kept apologizing and took out a small book from his clothes. There was a photo in it, which should be of the soldier's wife and daughter. Paul realized that the other person was a living person like himself, someone else's child and someone else's father, but in the war, he had to erase the other person's life. Taking advantage of the darkness, Paul returned to his own position. What surprised him was that the position was full of joy, and everyone was drinking and celebrating. It turned out that Germany could not accept the huge casualties without gaining any benefit from it, so it decided to sign on the negotiating table. When the soldiers learned that Germany was defeated, they celebrated that they could go home. Paul went to visit his good friend. He lost his right leg in the hope of living. He stabbed his neck with a fork while eating. Paul shouted for help, but the soldiers around him were unmoved and just looked on indifferently. Paul thought of his foolish self. The next day dawned quietly, without artillery fire. There is no sound of gunfire, which makes it feel like this is not a real world. The announcement came over the radio that the armistice agreement will officially come into effect at 11 o'clock today. Paul and Kate decided to go find some food. Paul fumbled for a while and found a few goose eggs, but was discovered by the farmer's son. The farmer came after him with a gun, but the two men ran away quickly. They didn't have time to fry the eggs, so they stirred them and drank the raw eggs. Kate went to the woods to pee, but she noticed the farmer's son looking behind her, holding a gun. Kate emerges from the woods, shot in the stomach. Paul helped him to the side of the road and asked for help from the passing German soldiers, but the man ignored them and drove away. Paul could only carry Kate and rush back to the camp. Paul couldn't believe that he was the only one of his classmates who had joined the army, and now he didn't even have any friends left. 2 hours before the armistice, the general called all the soldiers to come.
Soldaten! Wir werden jetzt zuschlagen mit all unserer Härte und Gewalt. Wir erobern die Ebenen noch vor 11 Uhr und beenden diesen Krieg mit einem Sieg!
How could these surviving soldiers believe his lies? Some people were unwilling to attack and were shot on the spot, while others could only hold on to their guns and die in vain. This time, there was no longer any light in Paul's eyes. When the French heard the earth-shattering shouts, the German army was already in front of them. Paul threw a grenade, pulled the bolt, fired, and did what he knew best. He rushed into the enemy trench, rescued a German recruit, and fought with the enemy. A bayonet penetrated his chest. Paul fell to his knees, feeling the passage of life. At the same time, the trumpet sounded and the armistice agreement came into effect. Paul used his last strength to walk towards the beam of light. There was silence outside. Soldiers from both sides walked towards their own camps, but Paul stayed on the Western Front battlefield forever. The once enthusiastic recruit has become a member of a number. No one will remember his name, where he is from, and how old he is, and war would never hurt Paul again.